Well, hello everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this webinar. This is a webinar organized by the social enterprise GovConnect in partnership with Hamilton. And this webinar is entitled Intelligent Ventilation, a bedside assistant to help and protect the lung. So my name is Luigi Camporotto. I'm a consultant intensivist at Guy's St Thomas's Hospital in London. And today's speakers are great experts in the field of mechanical ventilation. They've got huge international reputation and contributed a lot to mechanical ventilation and research. And we've got the first speaker is Giorgio Iotti. He's a professor of anesthesiology, University of Pavia, and is also the former head of intensive care at San Matteo Hospital in Pavia. And then it's a real pleasure to have Laura Buiterman-Kruizinger, who's a ventilation practitioner, a senior nurse, and working now doing research in Amsterdam. So Giorgio and Laura will in turn give a presentation around 20 minutes each, and then there will be time for discussion and questions. Please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A function as much as possible, and I'll do my best to ask as many of your questions as possible. Please be reassured that the webinar is recorded, and so you'll be able to watch it as many times as you like and share it with your friends and colleagues. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Giorgio Iotti, who is going to give us a talk on the birth and growth of the visionary idea. Giorgio, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi, for your nice introduction. I will switch off the camera now, and I will share my, okay. Share window. Here we are. Okay, share. So, birth and growth of the visionary idea. With the visionary idea is advanced automation applied to mechanical ventilation. This is my conflict of interest. I'm presently medical consultant of Hamilton Medical, which is the company that provides the most advanced form of closed-loop ventilation. Well, should I travel from Milano to somewhere with the conventional modern car? What shall I do? Guided by Google Maps, I drive the car, which means I manually use controlling and reacting the steering wheel, the accelerator pedal, brakes, depending on the car, clutch and gear, and minor controls. Interestingly, in a modern car, each of these functions includes automation, like power steering, ABS, power brakes, but with the conventional car, it's me who drives the car. Should I use a self-driving car of maximum level, I would just set the destination, and hopefully the car would take me to destination as quick as possible, while minimizing fuel consumption and pollution, respecting circulation rules, and driving safely, probably even better than so a combination of simplicity, effectiveness, so going to the target, and safety. Now let's switch to mechanical ventilation. What do I do for bridging to recovering intubated patient with acute respiratory failure with a conventional modern ventilator? In this case, I am guided by the monitoring system of the ventilator, but also by much more information, more monitoring, blood gas analysis, more tests, imaging, and so. And based on this information, I drive the ventilator, which means that I manually set and repeatedly readjust many controls. First of all, the ventilation mode. For instance, here you can see I should select one mode among these 10 options. Ventilation mode is the operating mode of the machine. Then once I have selected the ventilation mode, I have to select to set a number of controls. For instance, for SIMV, synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation, in this control panel there are 16 controls. And it is to be noted that most of these controls are very technical, like sensitivity, respiratory trigger sensitivity, ramp, wave flow. So controls that are very far from the physiological targets in which I am interested. So assisting ventilation by controlling oxygenation, CO2 elimination, the effort performed by the patient. That has not a direct relationship with all these controls. So this requires a lot of knowledge and experience. Which is the alternative? Advanced automation. A first step is adaptive support ventilation, ASV, which in practice is an automatic generator of ventilatory pattern. So we set minute ventilation instead of that replaces many of these controls. So we set minute ventilation and the ASV algorithm selects automatically tidal volume, frequency, air ratio based on given principles and continuous measurements of respiratory system mechanics. So one control for ventilation and two controls as determinants of oxygenation, PEEP and oxygen concentration. Which is the next step? Intelligent ASV is the step of automation of these three parameters. So a ventilation controller is added based on continuous monitoring of entitled CO2 and for the actively breathing patient of spontaneous frequency. And this controller will automatically select minute ventilation. An oxygenation controller based on data from about oxygen saturation from a pulse oximeter connected to the ventilator will control oxygen concentration and PEEP. So in Intelligent ASV, we will have a few controls, different kinds of controls, based on physiological targets. And the automatic system will directly control the arterial blood gases, that is PaO2 and PaCO2, while preventing ventilator-induced lung injury. So combination of simplicity, effectiveness, going directly to the targets, and safety, mechanical safety of ventilation. User interface. This is the very simple control panel of ASV, just three controls: minute ventilation, PEEP, and oxygen concentration. This is even overcome by Intelligent, in which you can see that these controls are automatically set. So they change automatically, while based on algorithm for controlling CO2 elimination and oxygenation. these two functions can be finely tuned and adjusted by the user operating on physiological controls for targets of CO2 and saturation. Then the user has the opportunity, the possibility to communicate with the system by providing additional information. For instance, information about the patient. Brain injury. Brain injury means to start a special program for strict control of CO2, or chronic hypercapnia, which means to start a special control with CO2 targets higher than normal. Or the user can communicate special wishes, like quick win, starting the quick win program to particularly promote weaning from mechanical ventilation. So the system is in any case able to wean automatically the patient, but in this case, a particular speed will be provided. So sophisticated simplicity, but what is behind? I would like to show you how behind there are well-recognized and solid pathophysiological principles and adaptation by closed-loop control. So the first point is the basic principle of ASV is the automatic selection of the ventilatory pattern, which is frequency, child volume, and duty cycle, inspiratory-expiratory ratio, based on respiratory mechanics, continuous measurement, and based on concept of energetics, all for effectiveness and lung protection. The point is to find the optimal frequency, and the method is based on the study of two great physiologists that published this very important studies in 1950, Arthur Otis, and 1960, Jerry Mills. Both these researchers have shown that there is a U relationship between the respiratory frequency and the force necessary for inspiration, mid, or the work developed for used for developing inspiration. So and the optimal frequency correspond to the minimum force, mid, or the minimum work. And ASV uses a combination of these two concepts. It's important to understand that minimum work and force concepts of ASV do not mean a minimum performed by the patient. This means minimum energy transferred to the lungs to achieve ventilation. And therefore, it means a maximum mechanical protection for the sick lungs. So a very important concept, especially in the most difficult to ventilate patients. Interestingly, these principles of ASV anticipated by many years a concept in which we have found very much, intensivists have found much interest in the last few years, the mechanical power, minimizing the mechanical power for protecting the lungs from ventilation injury. This is just one of many papers that have been recently published on mechanical power of ventilation on ARDS. And the principles on which ASV and intelligent ASV are based should allow to maximize the sum of the dynamic components of mechanical power, so are very much in line with this concept. Optimal frequency. What is the optimal frequency? The optimal frequency, according to MID, depends on one parameter of respiratory mechanics, that is RC, the time constant. Time constant is a parameter that we normally don't use in clinical practice, but it's very interesting because it describes synthetically with just one number the mechanical features of the lungs, of the respiratory system. It's a fast system with a short time constant, and in these cases, the more appropriate frequency will be a higher than normal frequency, or a slow lung, long time constant, several seconds. And in this case, the best frequency, the optimal frequency will be lower than normal. And interestingly, the time constant can be measured with these two methods by the analysis, breath-by-breath analysis of the flow volume loop at each breath. This is inspiration, this is expiration, inspiration, expiration, and the time constant corresponds to the slope of the part of expiration. So it's a data that can be collected on a breath-by-breath basis by the ventilator. Second point, control of ventilation based on entitled CO2 monitoring. Well, this is a very old concept, nearly as old as modern mechanical ventilation. Modern mechanical ventilation birth was probably in the early 50s. This is the first important publication by Dr. Engström, an infectivologist of Stockholm, who designed the first mechanical ventilator, a very simple machine, very simple machine that in practice was just replacing the hands of the volunteer who was ventilated, the patients with respiratory muscle paralysis. Interestingly, only a few years later, 1957, 1959, in United States, Jack Frumin was publishing about a physiological respirator. So a carbon dioxide controlled artificial respirator. So a ventilator that was mimicking the closed loop working of our respiratory system and respiratory center. So based on the analysis of CO2 in the expired gas, the physiological respirator of Frumin was setting the tidal volume. And you can see how precisely it was able to follow the target changes in tidal CO2. These concepts were unfortunately forgotten, were not considered, and were forgotten for 50 years up to Intelligent Asv, which is the first mode that is working after the physiological respirator of Frumin, that is working by closed loop control on end-tidal CO2. Intelligent Asv follows about CO2 also another very extremely important principle, permissive CO2 targets. This is an idea that of Keith Hickling that was published in the 90s and that changed completely our approach to mechanical ventilation. So before, our target was normal CO2. After Hickling, it was, yes, possibly normal CO2, but if ventilation is difficult, higher CO2, like in the COPD patients, like in chronic respiratory failure. And this is exactly the approach that is followed by Intelligent for CO2. This is the automatic target for CO2. Normal with entitled CO2 close to 40 millimeters of mercury if ventilation is easy, and then progressively higher the more ventilation becomes difficult. Third point, control of oxygenation. FiO2 and PEEP based on pulse oximetry. This is PEFIOS, the automatic control of PEEP and FiO2 based on saturation. So based on saturation, if saturation is too low, the system applies the combined increase of oxygen concentration and PEEP. And the other way around, if oxygenation is doing well. So if saturation is, as you can see, the path of rise and of drop is different. So the system includes an artificial hysteresis to delay the drop of PEEP and in order to favor, to wait for alveolar stabilization, which is very important in the treatment of the sick lung. PEFIOS comes from an idea that was developed in the 90s. This is the first trial of PEFIOS in Boston in 1995, and you can see the two paths, increase and decrease of PEEP and oxygen. Interestingly, the increase path is very close to this increase of FiO2 and PEEP that corresponds to the PEEP FiO2 table of ARDSnet that was published in 2000, so 5 years later, the PEFIOS paper, and it is to be considered that the ARDSnet PEEP FiO2 table is probably today the most commonly used way for setting PEEP based on blood scatter analysis in ARDS. So in conclusion, IntelliVent ASV is the only ventilation mode designed for semi-automatic management of the entire ventilatory treatment of a large majority of intubated patients. It strives for simplicity, effectiveness, and safety in manager mechanical ventilation by relying, as I have shown you, on well-recognized and solid pathophysiological principles. Then, which are the advantages for the user? Which are the advantages for the patient? This will be a topic that will be treated by the next speaker, Laura Grising. And so I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Giorgio. That was fantastic talk. Lots of pathophysiology and understanding of the way the system works. Laura, it is my pleasure to welcome you. And Laura is going to give us a talk on lung protective ventilation at the time of COVID-19. So Laura, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi, for your introduction. So today I have the pleasure to share with you my experiences about IntelliVent ASV. And first of all, thanks to Hamilton Medical for the invitation to give a lecture today. So first, I will focus shortly on the history of automated ventilation, and then I will point out the differences between IntelliVent ASV and conventional ventilation. And then I will explain why me and my team at my ICU started with automated ventilation and how we performed the implementation and what our experiences are. And I will share with you the latest scientific results regarding IntelliVent ASV, and I will finish with the future. So automated ventilation is not really new. Already in 1992, the first ventilatory mode was developed, which integrated closed-loop principles based on the flow the patient generated. It was here in 1992 called PAF+, and as you can see, the developments continued. And the topic of this lecture today is IntelliVent ASV, which is, in my opinion, also the most developed mode of automation. So At the intensive care unit, mechanical ventilation is our core business. Important to know is that at one side mechanical ventilation is necessary and sometimes even life-saving, but on the other side it can cause ventilator-induced lung injury. So we observe our patients closely, we check vital signs, ventilatory parameters, blood gases, and depending on what we see and what we measure, we change the settings of the ventilator. For example, a bit more oxygen or a higher respiratory rate to exhale more carbon dioxide. And that's what we do when we are with our patient, when we as nurses and doctors are available. And of course you can imagine, or you all know, that with the daily business on the ICU floor, we cannot always set and change the ventilator settings as often and as optimal as we would like. It is a dynamic process, and to ventilate lung protective with the ever-changing pulmonary condition, it can be a challenge, particularly in sick patients, to ventilate lung protective. And with IntelliVent ASV, like Professor Jotti already told, the patient is ventilated with predefined ventilation and oxygenation targets. The settings, like the tidal volume and the respiratory rate, are under control of the ventilator algorithms. And as an ICU nurse or ICU doctor, you can change your targets and also limit some settings. Important is to realize that as an ICU nurse or doctor, you are always in the lead of setting the ventilator. You are not being replaced, but instead of being the pilot, you are supervising the autopilot. But it's of course imaginable that that requires a different way of observing and a different way of adjusting the ventilator. So when I and my colleagues at my ICU got interested in automated ventilation, we got interested for several reasons. First, we realized that automated ventilation is much faster than us in adjustment of support. It can decrease, it can increase support, and it adjusts 24/7, based on the patient needs and based on the patient lung mechanics. Also, a patient can receive controlled or support ventilation, also based, of course, on what the patient needs. And automated ventilation can switch earlier than us between these two. And weaning of mechanical ventilation, meaning decrease of the settings, the support, the oxygen, the pressures, that also occurs 24/7. Meaning the patient receives exactly what he needs continuously, and that can only lead to lung protective ventilation. And in the end, even more personalized ventilation. Since years, the vision of our ICU is to be innovative, to improve patient healthcare, to improve patient outcomes, but also to improve our work happiness. So all our doctors and nurses are involved in extra tasks appropriate to their interests. So of course my interest is mechanical ventilation. So the initiative to start with IntelliVent ASV came from me and my colleague in our roles as ventilation practitioner, which is comparable to a respiratory therapist. And we got support from our intensivists after explaining the importance and the reasons. And we got help from dedicated ICU nurses who acted as stakeholders. We designed an intensive training program with courses, masterclasses, and a lot of bedside teaching. And we as ventilation practitioners guided the implementation, and we were available at all times for questions and help, of course, at least during the first months of the implementation. So we trained our team in 2 months, in December 2019 and January 2020. And we started for real in February 2020, and we got a bit experienced because soon our team favored the use of IntelliVent ASV over conventional ventilation. And of course, there were questions and things we had to get used to. But most of the time, the team was happy to take on the challenge And the team supported this implementation, which makes it, of course, for us a lot easier. So, and as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic started. In the Netherlands, it started in March 2020. This was only 1 month after starting with IntelliVent ASV. So you can imagine it felt a bit scary to ventilate patients with a new disease, of which little or no knowledge was yet available, actually. And also with the ventilatory mode, in which we had little experience. But again, our team took the challenge, and I can say that my team at the ICU is quite experienced in applying lung protective ventilation. So with so many patients in need of mechanical ventilation, this pandemic and this implementation was a very good and a very extensive learning school. So of course we became in the end also very experienced. And what we noticed was, at least once we were experienced after a few months, it supported our staff and our team in a way we could not imagine. Because in this pandemic where the workload was intense, once we set IntelliVent ASV, it was actually one thing less to concern. Because we knew mechanical ventilation went well and we ventilated lung protective. And we could focus for, at least for some hours, on all the other things we needed to do. And we know from some studies, which are indicated below, that there are less interactions between user and ventilator. And that also indicates less workload, but that's also what we experienced, especially during the busy months or years, actually, during the pandemic. And with the growing number of patients worldwide, and the lesson of the recent pandemic that hospital systems, including ICUs, can easily be disrupted, we must be aware of the fact that gaps can arise between supply in healthcare and demand of healthcare, as you can see in these two examples on this slide. So we want to treat our patients with evidence-based interventions, and there are quite some studies now available about IntelliVent ASV, and I can share a couple of them with you. So this was a single-center randomized controlled trial in the Netherlands, in which 220 patients were included after cardiothoracic surgery. And the patients received or IntelliVent ASV or conventional ventilation. And a lot of data was collected using breath-by-breath data. And ventilatory parameters were clustered and divided in zones, optimal, acceptable, and critical zones. And what the studies show is that with IntelliVent ASV, there's more time spent in the optimal zones. More optimal zones time means actually more lung protective and more safe ventilation. And also in this figure, you can see that here, IntelliVent ASV reached optimal zones faster and spent longer in the lung protective ventilation zone. In this study, which is quite recently published, we studied the conversion from conventional ventilation to IntelliVent ASV, 2 and 1 hour before and 1 and 2 hours after the conversion. And it was in 51 patients with COVID-19 ARDS. This was conducted, the study, in the first wave of the pandemic in the Netherlands. And we included these patients, they were without spontaneous breathing activity. And what we show here was a lower driving pressure and a lower mechanical power, meaning less energy transfer with IntelliVent ASV. And in both indicating that the lower is better, and the lower the driving pressure and mechanical power is, the more it is lung protective. So it's more safe for the lungs. And what we show also in this study, that the lower driving pressure and the lower energy transfer, the lower mechanical power, was the result of a slightly increase in the tidal volume, but it stayed within the generally accepted safety limits, and there was a large decrease in the respiratory rate. Important to say also with this slide is that the gas exchange remained similar, meaning that there was no difference between end-tidal CO2 and oxygen levels in the patient. So meaning that the ventilation stays the same. So this was also a nice study from the research group in Zurich. They also studied the difference between IntelliVent ASV and conventional ventilations in the COVID-19 ARDS patients. And the patients were ventilated with either IntelliVent ASV or conventional ventilation. And they also collected a lot of data minute by minute by extracting data from the digital patient system. And what they also show is that IntelliVent ASV ventilates with lower mechanical power, as you can see with this red line. And also they show that IntelliVent ASV spent more time in lung protective ranges, also indicated more lung protective ventilation. So with regard of effectiveness of automated ventilation, this systematic review shows us that automated ventilation, not only IntelliVent ASV, but also the previous mentioned ventilatory modes at one of the first slides, that it decreases the time of weaning. So meaning that the patient can be liberated earlier from the ventilator. And what's up for the future? Well, several studies are running because me and my research group, we would like to see more results in IntelliVent ASV, also regarding ventilator-free days, mortality, but also again lung protective ventilation, and then from good, well-designed randomized controlled trials. And we know from a recent systematic review that IntelliVent ASV performs at least as good as conventional ventilation. That it also has the potential, also in our experience, that it can decrease workload, but superiority has not been shown yet. And of course, I would like to see that, so our studies are focusing on that. And also, there are some challenges with artificial intelligence, especially in using artificial intelligence in healthcare, because the development in healthcare is a bit slow compared to the artificial intelligence in normal life. Caregivers are against artificial intelligence or are afraid of it, probably thinking maybe to be replaced, or simply have the thoughts that they can do it better than the computer. Also, legal and ethical factors are always there to consider. However, I think artificial intelligence and automated ventilation offers considerable potential to improve the quality of care we provide to our patients. And that's also our main goal. So in conclusion, why should we use automated ventilation? I think ventilators are getting smarter. That's what we know. And I think in these modern time, it's not easy to ignore this fact. And based on experience and research, we can say that automated ventilation is efficient, that it's safe, and it has the potential to outperform us. And I think we must see it as a supportive tool to help us in decreasing our workload. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. That was a fantastic talk, very interesting. And also thank you, both of you, for giving so much information, but be absolutely perfect in terms of timing. So that will give us plenty of opportunity to discuss. And once again, I would like to invite all people attending just to feel free to drop any question, doubts, things that were not very clear, things that you would like to ask, and we'll do our best to answer as much as possible with the time allocated. But while you think about a question, maybe I can start off with a couple of ones. Laura, may I start with you, if you don't mind, asking you a question? So I was very impressed that you started essentially a new way of training your staff at a time where there was the maximum pressure, so during a pandemic. I was very curious to see how you managed that. So introducing ASV in people who have not used it before, and what was the most common barrier that you found, you know, during the implementation of the training?
Yeah, well, thank you for your question, Luigi. Well, our ICU had a small experience with ASV only, so which is the basic, of course, of IntelliVent ASV. But I think the largest barrier during the implementation was, I think just the workload and the highest pressure of the COVID-19 admissions. And maybe that the colleagues, they really had to look for time to get involved with IntelliVent ASV and to have to focus on that. But I'm very proud of my team because they always want to be innovative, and they always want to do better. So somehow, I don't even know how, but somehow we managed it. And colleagues and the team, they just took the challenge and thought we are going to do this. And I think basically also because once we got a bit experienced, we noticed the biggest advantage. So it supported itself in that way, I think.
May I make a question to Laura?
Luigi, are you muted?
I am
yes,
muted.
Of course. Yes.
No? Luigi is muted. Okay.
Not anymore.
Please, Georgia, go ahead. Yes, this is a conversation. Yeah.
So Laura, finally, how long do you judge that was necessary for you to get a good knowledge for playing with IntelliVent, with such a pressure as it was with the COVID emergency?
Yeah, well, this pressure also helped us, of course, because we had so much patience and we got experience day by day, because every day all the colleagues could learn, of course. But we used ASV before for 6 months, so that was also an advantage and helpful, because the basics of ASV we already knew. But I think after a month or 3 or 4, we got experienced enough, so there were less questions, and people could work on his own with IntelliVent ASV. But I think for being very, very experienced and understanding everything of IntelliVent ASV, what took, I think, 9 months or so.
And you had the advantage of starting with the difficult patients.
Yeah, we started with difficult patients. Yeah, that's true. But it helped with the learning and improving, with the experience.
Fantastic, Laura. We've got a question from Jill. Basically, I'll read it because it's basically referring to your last slide, highlighting the issue of the legal and ethical factors. And obviously there is the question I read, say, under legal and ethical factors, I can see caution switching from pressure control ventilation to IntelliVent, particularly when there was little time for experimentation or trial. But would you like to comment particularly on whether you faced any legal issue or some governance issue within your department?
Yeah, of course I will. Thank you for the question, Jill. It's true that we switched from indeed pressure-controlled ventilation to IntelliVent ASV, but we did it when we got some experience with IntelliVent ASV. So at least for a large part, we knew what we were doing actually. And we only did it when there was an experienced ventilation practitioner like myself and my colleague, but also intensivist. So the first weeks we literally sit next to the patient and to the ventilator. We were literally watching what IntelliVent ASV was doing. And when we thought we don't have the time anymore, or we didn't know what we are doing, or we don't know what IntelliVent is doing, actually, we stopped. We switched to conventional ventilation again, and we tried on to the next patient or the next day. But indeed, it is a little experimentation, but with our knowledge of IntelliVent ASV and also our extensive knowledge of mechanical ventilation, that I think it's an experimentation which improves patient care.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura. Giorgio, can I come to you? There is a question. Dennis is asking this question, which I think is very important. What kind of patients, which patient do you think they fail ASV most often? So perhaps a different way to ask the same question is, which ones are the ones they do very well, and the ones that you are more cautious because you think they fail more often? Thanks, Dennis, for asking that question.
Well, I think there are two. Well, one patient, the patient who fails is the patient who does not respond to the common rules in general, because since ASV and IntelliVent are based on physiology, so the rules are relatively simple and clear. But when a patient, for instance, has the dysregulation of the respiratory center, it does not. The loops do not work as expected, and so ASV may fail, or in any case is difficult the management, like in any other ventilation mode. If you paralyze the patient, then IntelliVent can manage it, but if you let the patient free, it may be very, very difficult. Then there are patients who do not respond well to pressure for recruitment. So as I have shown you, PEFIOS has a clear direction, so increasing PEEP and oxygen as long as there is an improvement in saturation. But if a patient does not improve substantially, the system will continue to increase PEEP. So it's important in that case, IntelliVent can be used, but you have to set a PEEP limitation. Otherwise, the system will go up to the top that is more than 20. You are muted.
I've got two questions, okay, which I think might be, well, they're separate, so I'll ask them separately. One very quick one, maybe Georgia, if you don't mind, and then another one, again, Laura, very quick one, if you don't mind. So, the one question from Ashraf is, do you use routinely PV tools to check recruitability in these patients? I assume just to make sure that your PEEP values are appropriate. So because there are few, maybe we'll keep our answers short, so we'll answer as many as possible. Thank you.
To whom the question, Luigi?
First one to you, Giorgio, and then I've got another one for Laura later
Thank
on.
you. Well,
Yes.
I personally use and like the information that can be obtained by static mechanics, by the slow maneuver provided by the PV tool. For instance, this can be a help for setting the PEEP limitation in a patient who is a poor responder, or in a patient in which from the PV tool, from the PV loop, you already understand that the PEEP needed will be very high, for instance. Of course, as the system, although sophisticated, is not so sophisticated. It follows one principle: oxygenation, or better, par component of oxygenation, that's saturation. It does not include information from hemodynamics. It does not include information from mechanics, except for safety. For setting PEEP, I mean, it uses mechanics for setting tidal volume and plateau.
Fantastic. And Laura, could you, there are quite a few questions about safety issues or reliability. So one again was about what about if you don't get a reliable pulse oximeter or end-tidal CO2 data, particularly when patients are mobilizing? I mean, how often have you found it? Is this an issue, and how do you solve it?
It's sometimes an issue, especially with the pulse oximetry, with the cold fingers in sick patients. Then you can turn the oxygenation controllers to manual, so you only have the ventilation controller on automated. But of course, if it's not reliable, then you can always switch back to conventional ventilation, because that's also something where we're good at.
Fantastic. Giorgio, could I ask another question? Ricardo is asking. I mean, you mentioned earlier on about patients having a dysregulated respiratory drive, and I think Ricardo's picked up on that, and he was just saying, do you consider measuring esophageal pressure in these patients who have a high respiratory effort while they are in IntelliVent ASV?
Absolutely, Luigi. This is a very, very, very important point. So in the actively breathing patient, ASV follows a very simple principle that is following respiratory rate. The spontaneous respiratory rate is an index of effort performed by the patient. And this we know since ever, I think, that is a very rough indicator of the effort. So there is a relationship between work on breathing and frequency, between effort and frequency, but it's not with a great dispersion. So, and I think that this is one of the points on which IntelliVent could improve and should improve. So the management of the difficult actively breathing patient. Clearly, if the patient is paralyzed, the management is easier. It's easier for the control by the human, by direct control of humans, and is much easier for the automatic controller. Again, Luigi, you lost the microphone.
Sorry, I'm just saying too quick. I think I'm being muted remotely, so
Yes.
I still think that I'm on, but I'm off. I should look at the microphone sign.
We have to pay attention to remote controllers.
Absolutely. I'm just going to say, one of the questions was about if a patient is asynchronous, would you think that ASV is still a good mode, or would you rather go into spontaneous mode? Giorgio, and then Laura, one for you about bronchopleural fistulas.
Well, for synchrony, so in an actively breathing patient, ASV IntelliVent works like an automatic pressure support. And so switching to pressure support would have no advantage because it is already pressure support. And so the good synchronization depends on the patient and on the quality of the ventilator for synchronizing. If it is an extremely difficult patient for synchronization, the trick that I like is to use a bilevel mode. So to favor asynchrony, and so what I call a quiet chaos. So the two activities are somehow compatible. They are not fighting, but they are really asynchronous. ASV does not allow quiet chaos, so you have to change the mode.
Okay, thank you. And Laura, what do you think about patients with bronchopleural fistula? Are you concerned? Would you eliminate? Would you use it or not use it? What cautions?
No, we don't use it in patients with bronchopleural fistula. It's also a contraindication indicated by Hamilton.
Perfect. Thank you. Well,
finally, it depends also on the flow. So if it is a very high flow, the leak it cannot be used. With the moderate leakage, it can be done. Also because the ventilator has a good capability of compensation.
Fantastic. I've got one question I would like to ask, because I was very, Laura, I was very interested in your very nice study. Congratulations on the sub-study of the Prevent COVID study. And I was very interested because what you have shown is that IntelliVent ASV decreases driving pressure and decreases mechanical power, mainly as a way of substantial decrease in respiratory rate.
Yeah.
But the tidal volume was slightly higher. So what do you think explains that difference in delta pressure? Was it the PEEP very different? So I just wondering whether you could give us some idea how these three parameters go together.
Yeah, I understand your question. Thank you. Because we discussed this a lot and we cannot explain it in total because the PEEP remains similar. There was no difference in PEEP settings. So we focused indeed on the effects of the slightly increase in the tidal volume to compensate for the very much lower respiratory rate. So we might think that there is some recruitment at the slightly increase of the tidal volume because the difference was not that much. It was, I think, 6.4 milliliters per kilograms ideal body weight with conventional ventilation, and it was 7.1 with IntelliVent ASV. So it's not even that much of a difference. But we think that we might, that IntelliVent ASV might recruit at some parts in the lungs with a slightly increase. But I cannot, I cannot explain it totally. Not yet. We discussed it a lot. Oh, you muted again. Sorry.
Unless there was some auto PEEP in the high respiratory rate group, but anyway, it's interesting. Now if you don't mind, we'll go 1 minute over because obviously the questions are coming thick and fast, which is great. So I was just thinking, Jill asked another question, whether it is appropriate to ask those patients who had intervention on their records if they passed away. So I think Jill is very into the legal and ethical stuff as well. Don't know what your thoughts are.
I'm reading the question. I don't know if I understand the question.
Okay. Well, I don't know whether, Jill, would you like to be able to explain it? I don't know whether you can talk, or we'll try and respond maybe in writing later on.
Apologies, Jill won't be able to speak.
Okay.
But all of the Q&A will be sent to the 3 speakers.
Fantastic.
And we will be sending all registrants a questionnaire with all answers.
Oh, great.
Fantastic. Well, in that case, given the we're over time, and I'm sure we can go on forever, but that's the time allocated for today. I would like to thank very much Laura for giving us a great talk, and Giorgio for a fantastic talk. I would like to thank all the attendees for being so engaged and asking lots of questions. And I would like to thank you also, Jen from GovConnect and Hamilton for today. And hopefully I'll see you soon in a different event. Or thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Oh, bye.
Are we back on?